In this lecture, I'll discuss evolutionary thought that framed the thinkings of evolutionary thinkers in the 19th century in social theory. And as in much of anthropology, the thoughts that were brought into social theory were derived from elsewhere, from other disciplines. So in the lecture, in the screencast here, I'll discuss the evolution of evolutionary thinking, beginning with Aristotelian notions of the great chain of being, moving through Plato's essentialism, till we get to recognize some rather popular figures and as well as less known figures in the biological and physical sciences, such as Carolus and Linnaeus for his binomial nomenclature or two-name naming system, the probably lesser known works of Cuvier and Catastrophism, along with some other individuals that preceded his work, Charles Lyell's work as a geologist in the notion of uniformitarianism. The first mention of evolution in this context is by Lamarck. We then go to a discussion of variational evolution, and we look at some of the interconnections between these lines of thought in the physical and biological as well as geologic sciences, and how that permeates into early thinking of social theorists, including Spencer, Morgan, and Tyler. The great chain of being was derived from Aristotelian principles that were elaborated on during the Middle Ages. And as we saw from some of our earlier readings in this class, that in fact this was utilized, hierarchically utilized to differentiate different types of humans, and indeed even suggesting that some humans were perhaps less than human, but at the very minimum to arrange them in some sort of hierarchy. The great chain of being suggests that every kind of living organism was linked to every other kind, and that human beings in particular occupied a space between both flesh and spirit. It was seen as God's creation, as perfect and without any gaps. And so essentially existing in perpetuity in this given hierarchical arrangement. We can also see some other interesting aspects in terms of the hierarchy and what that means in terms of humans' relationship with the overall environment and how humans are conceptualized in the broader sphere of physical biological sciences as well. The notion of essentialism is derived from the works of Plato. We have Plato's ideas of belief in fixed ideas or forms that exist perfect and unchanging in eternity or in perpetuity. For Plato, there are two worlds, an ideal and a material. The material world that we see around us, the actual objects in the temporal world that we occupy, are seen, according to this notion of essentialism, as imperfect material realizations of some sort of ideal form. That would be ideal form. Yeah. The ideal is the form that defines their kind. And so I made this parallel in the context of class. It would be similar to a ideal form, an initial document, and then a photocopier where you get some grain on there because of toner issues or the scanner. It's a less than ideal copy of some in the material manifestation of the ideal form. Linnaeus's work is probably one of the best known so far. If you've had high school biology classes, it's likely that you've come across binomial nomenclature or the two-name naming system. Linnaeus provided a systematic framework that helped to organize and classify different life forms. It was not the only classificatory mechanisms. There are some suggestions that earlier classificatory systems come from Asia rather than Europe. Nevertheless, Linnaeus' two-name naming system, overall, there was this belief in the immutability of the species, that is, that life forms were created by God and they could not change over time. De Maillet, writing in between 1722 and 1732, produces Talamad, or which is his name backwards, or discourses between an Indian philosopher and French missionary on a number of specific topics. De Maillet occupies the position of Indian philosopher in his engagements and discussions with French missionary, which he takes to be the scientific status quo at the time. And so he uses the voice of an Indian philosopher to challenge existing ways of thinking about the world as a whole. And De Maillet comes up with some interesting ideas that, while we could say certainly that they are not correct, in terms of how he goes about finding them out. For example, the age of the Earth is related to the diminution of the sea. That is, that the rate or decline of the level of the sea will progress at a steady rate. And from this, we can ascertain the age of the Earth by seeing how much of the Earth is actually exposed or not underwater. One of the other interesting things, and this is sort of a precursor to this notion of deeper time in terms of geologic time, contra to some of the dictates, some of the edicts of the church, which framed the age of the earth as very young in a geologic sense. And De Maillet also looked at the fossil record, and he noted that some species had in fact gone extinct. And so with this, we see changes in that in fact the world that we see around us today is not the world that was created by God existing in perpetuity. De Buffon writes a book on natural history and develops the evolutionary theory of degeneration that I'll talk about a little bit later. The key observations, and again, some of these are precursors to Darwinian thought and evolutionary thought as a whole. The notion of physical variation between the species. This is a key idea in Darwin, this idea of variation. That different animals had underlying structural similarities. So in terms of anatomical similarities, although they might look different on the surface, the underlying, they looked very similar. He also made the connections between food supply and population that actually, well before the individual who's more well known for this, who is Thomas Malthus for his 1795 essay on population, his initial version of that, he ends up publishing a number of other essays on population. De Buffon also points out that in fact extinction has occurred, so we don't see this idea of God's perfect creation existing in perpetuity. Cuvier's notion of catastrophism, he also notes extinction, but rather than new species come about, just mere replacement of species introduced from elsewhere. Charles Lyell, a geologist, was very influential for Charles Darwin. He urged Darwin to publish his work and made Darwin aware of Wallace's essentially nipping at his heels, or that Wallace was intending to publish with much less information. Hence, Darwin and Wallace published together with one another. Lyell's notion of uniformitarianism in a geologic sense notes that the current processes that we're seeing geologically can be used to reconstruct the past history of the Earth. And this was based on the assumption that the same gradual processes of uplift and erosion that changed the Earth's surface today had also been working in the past. And this becomes very important in the context of later work in both archaeology and biological anthropology in terms of things like stratigraphic superposition, looking at the geology and its relevance for relative dating in archaeology and biological anthropology. Lamarck's work, Lamarck is the first one here to really derive a theory of evolution. One of the co-workers on this was Erasmus Darwin, Charles's grandfather. The notion of transformational evolution assumes an essentialist species in a uniform environment, wherein each individual member of a species will transform itself to meet the challenges of a changed environment through the laws of use or disuse. That is the use it or lose it, and then the subsequent inheritance of those acquired characteristics. So stretching out a neck, these traits are then passed on to the next generation. And so in one generation, we see these big evolutionary changes. This contrasts with Darwin and Wallace's notion of evolution by natural selection, or what is also referred to as variational evolution, first really explained thoroughly in The Origin of the Species in 1859. Darwin and Wallace note that variants that are more successful or fitter will survive and reproduce more offspring, who will then inherit the traits that made their parents fit. Fitness in a Darwinian sense, hence, is a measure of an organism's ability to compete in a struggle for existence. Darwin and Wallace's variational evolutionary principles are three. They are as follows. First, variation, that no two individuals are the same. Second, heredity, offspring will resemble their parents. And then by mechanisms of natural selection, that is, first, in every generation, varied individuals are generated within a species due to genetic mutation. Second, those varied individuals best suited to the current environment survive and produce more offspring. This work is combined with the work of Mendel and later becomes part of the new new evolutionary synthesis in the 1920s and 30s, which looks at things like populations as well as genetics. It's important to point out that at the time of both Mendel and Darwin, the notion of the gene wasn't coined yet. This had to wait till the early 1900s. In terms of explaining cultural diversity, there were two main theories that dominated discourse during the early 19th century when these writers were noting the progress, the supposed unilineal progress of mankind. First, degenerationism, that there was a biblical cause for degeneration in human society. Human hubris, single language, allowed for unitary work to build the Tower of Babel, to ascend to the heights of God. All people belonged at this time to a single civilization. God destroyed the tower, creating differences in language, and then dispersing the people, with some degenerating further than others, losing civilization and becoming savages. Progressivism, on the other hand, noted that society started out primitive, but were progressing towards a more civilized state overall. Progressivism gained favor in Europe by the time of the Industrial Revolution. However, it did not remain unchallenged. The main social theorists of the time in the 19th century, evolutionists, include Karl Marx and Frederick Engels. I'll specifically talk about, however, the work of Herbert Spencer, Lewis Henry Morgan, and E.B. Tylor. Spencer was interested in evolution as a general phenomena. He believed that change was driven by the struggle for survival. He was also famous for his organic analogy, where he compared human societies to biological organisms. Social evolution, according to Spencer, should be studied in the same way that one studied biological evolution. So here, Spencer brings out the notion of positivism within the context of studying social systems. Spencer notes that primitive societies with simple technology and undifferentiated social structure, and they also lacked economic specializations. This achieved widespread acceptance. One of the consequences of Spencer's work was social Darwinism, wherein the right of Western powers to dominate those that were less technology advanced was promulgated. He argued that state welfare, this was used to argue that state welfare, education, and public health programs were contrary to the laws of nature and should be avoided because they slowed the evolutionary process that was weeding out the unfit members of society. He was an adamant opponent, on the other hand, of the military, the Church of England, and particularly imperialism. Lewis Henry Morgan wrote Ancient Society in 1877. He attempted to trace the evolution of human society from primeval times up to the Victorian era, which he believed to be the high point of human civilization. Following Turgot, he divided human cultural development into three stages: savagery, barbarism, and civilization, then breaking those down into another three stages. So we have trinities within trinities for Lewis Henry Morgan. Following Spencer, evolution is from simple to complex in a unilineal fashion. Evolutionary progress is not through competition, however, but propelled by what Morgan referred to as germs of thought driven by the development of new subsistence strategies. E.B. Tylor, in his work Primitive Culture in 1871, noted that one could construct early stages of cultural evolution by studying survivals. Everything in society that did not have a function he understood was a survival from a previous stage of cultural evolution. Therefore, one could learn about the past through the study of these cultural leftovers. In specific and primitive culture, he also looks at the evolution of religion, which was the most basic concept. The most basic concept underlying the development of religion was animism, which then later evolved into polytheism and progressed into what he viewed as the highest form of religious belief, enlightened monotheism. On the other hand, he did take some pains to describe the reasoning or the rationale behind the use of animism in particular societies. So in review, we've covered the evolution of evolutionary history from Aristotle and Plato all the way up to Lamarck and Darwin, and how this has influenced social theorists, which have come to dominate much of anthropology early on.